Hi, everybody, and welcome to the SAP Press Book Club edition. And so I'm Kendall Tyler, and we have a great guest today. And her name is Janet, and she wrote the book Controlling with SAP S/4HANA. So it's a little thick, but it's actually a really good read. So how we're going to do this is we're going to kind of get everybody in. And we're going to talk to Janet about her book and find out a lot of really cool things that are coming down the pipe, which I think is neat. So anyway, if you don't know me, my name is Kendall Tyler. I work for DXC, and I help customers like you get onto S4 or support or anything around SAP. So that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 31 years. So I was just talking to Janet, and Janet has been in SAP for 30 years too. So Janet is, by way of when she talks, she's in Germany, but she doesn't sound German, and she works for SAP, and she is the Chief Product Owner of Management Accounting, which is Controlling. And so she's been working for SAP for 30 years. This is her 10th book. And the neat thing about Janet is that we have like an inside person who's now going to tell us not only about her book, but also kind of the, what's happening, because that's kind of really what all of us want to know, like what's going on. Everything's changing so fast. So anyway, Janet, say hey to everybody.
Hi, everybody. So nice to meet everybody. As Kendall says, the mystery of my accent. Obviously, I've been living in Germany for 30 years, but I'm British originally. I've actually got German citizenship as well now, Brexit, of course. But yeah, English is still my first language. We still speak English at home, even though my kids go to school in Germany and have graduated in Germany. So we kind of live in both worlds, which is pretty much like SAP. Those of you who were around 30 years ago will have definitely seen some German screens, some German words, some, those K's and D's and M's, they all come from German words.
And aren't you a linguist?
Yeah, I am actually. If you could see the books behind me, I'm hoping you can't actually see how untidy it is, but I actually studied German and French at university, and I speak Russian as well. And, I came to SAP thinking, oh, great, they're in Heidelberg. That's right on, for those of you who don't know where your geography of Germany, Heidelberg's on the border with France. So I can be in France in about 30 minutes. I'm very close to Switzerland. I'm very close to Luxembourg. I'm very close to Belgium. So I really enjoyed the idea of being able to just travel and swap languages at will. And of course, working in Europe was great compared to being up in Blackpool and having to get a boat before you can go anywhere and meet anybody.
See, here in the US, I either talk Southern, or I have to talk like Northern, or I could talk Midwest, but I don't get to talk like totally different languages. That's, so you have one up on me on that one. But we, so, I think that, because we were talking about a lot of stuff about your book, and, a lot of people are like, you've done 10 books, and why did you feel like there was a need to write one more? I mean, that's our question. Like, what's, so controlling's not really a new topic, but what was your driving, what was it?
I mean, actually, you're absolutely right. Controlling itself, you can find in the textbooks of 30, 40 years ago, the textbooks that I used to learn it originally. The big thing was that we totally changed our architecture. So certainly in the German speaking world, we always had this idea of the financial accounting and the controlling world. And the controlling world was where it really happened. And financial accounting was, well, yeah, you did a bit of bookkeeping. And that was a very historical sort of understanding of the way the applications worked. And that's the way most Swiss, Austrian, German companies thought. And what we did with S/4HANA was we actually brought the two worlds together and said, we're going to talk the same language and live in the same table, which turns out to be the Universal Journal. And so, of course, what you find now is this single table where you've got your accounts, your cost centers, your projects, all the things that you would consider controlling objects right through to your profitability segments, all sitting in this one place. And all of a sudden, all my explanations in my previous book about what's a cost element and what's a primary cost element and what's a secondary cost element, and all these kind of basic things that you needed to understand our world were kind of thrown out the window. except they weren't totally, because there were still these basic ideas that wage accounts are different from material accounts, are different from allocation accounts, and so on. So it was about saying,
do you think the Universal Journal has really changed? I mean, the way that, a global company can now, just operate?
Absolutely. I mean, what used to happen was people were trying to find ways to hold these two worlds together. So you'd have a very controlling, strong company, but they were having to do segment reporting according to IFRS and roll everything up at corporate level. And because you've got these very different data structures, so in consolidation, financial accounting, and controlling, there was an awful lot of Band-Aid and Excels and lookup tables trying to hold these worlds together. And I would tell people at the beginning that it was about a triangle. It was about what you wanted to do at a corporate level, what you wanted to do for local accounting, and then how you wanted to actually manage your business, which is really where controlling comes into play. But that you couldn't see controlling in total isolation, but as part of this bigger triangle. So of course it meant that I had to leave my cozy controlling world where I'd been for the last 25 years and actually learn quite a lot about accounting and quite a lot about consolidation as well. But the interesting thing is that's the way most of the customers that I'm working with work now. Whereas 25 years ago, I would do an installation and we would often be only installing at one plant. And that was complicated enough. And we would be doing it in one currency, in one accounting principle.
Yeah.
You'll now typically find I'm talking to the big corporates and they're trying to put in a template that they want to fit across the world. And we're really trying to say, well, what do you want to see at group level? What have you got to do at local level? Because you've got a special fiscal calendar, you've got special accounting requirements and so on. And how do you want to control your business? And how do you want to run that business? So really just the structures had changed and the way people were approaching this information. And also the business has changed. I mean, a lot of the business model, one of our other books was trying to justify, why would you go to S/4HANA? We didn't want to just say because it's great technology and it's super fast.
Next
we
thing.
To actually say there are business reasons. And one of them we said was, in the good old days, so when SAP first came along with industries, we kind of said, yeah, there's the product industries and there's the service industries. And I was a product costing girl, so I ignored the service industries, or except to the extent that, I might.
That's me. I'm the service people.
That you might have a banking solution to help finance your car or your tractor or whatever, but that wasn't my world. I was a product costing. I like the physical world. And of course, what you're finding now is you've still got the car makers and the tractor makers and all the people who are doing the things that they always did. But there's a much bigger service part of that business now. And they're coming to me and saying, well, how do we control it? Because it's not just a question of building a car, pushing it out the door and getting your invoice out. You've got a whole load of mobility services attached to that car. It's
don't you think because the way the world is changing so fast and new businesses are popping up out of existing businesses, that companies are like, well, we're set up to do this, but now all of a sudden we've just changed our whole way of doing things. And now we're doing this but we're not set up that way.
Exactly. And that's often the driver that people will come to me. It's not just the big corporates saying, hey, we're super big and Janet tells us how we should structure ourselves. The other one you'll typically find is the business that I had when I started my SAP implementation is no longer the same business. So my favorite example is always Ringier in Switzerland. They were one of our very first customers outside of Germany. They're a Swiss media company. And 30 years ago, they were all about getting newspapers into the station so people could pick them up on their way to work. Mm-hmm. If we ask ourselves now, how many people actually read a physical newspaper? It's tiny.
Yeah.
Some people do, and you can see all my physical books behind me. I'm an old-fashioned girl, but
I like a book too. But even we were talking about products are getting more expensive or more complicated, and people are they just don't last as long as maybe we used to think things did, or just because more technology, or we were talking about a refrigerator. Mm-hmm. You were talking about how companies are trying to think outside the box. How can I expand my business? And then their whole new product would be we're now going to service and we're going to rent. We're not just going to,
Exactly. So, I think the important thing is you tend to think, it used to be product or service. And now it's product and service. So, I'm still talking to the people who make washing machines and refrigerators and all the people I was talking to 30 years before. But what they used to do is they were getting their washing machines and refrigerators into the stores where people like me would buy them. And my idea of service 30 years ago would be I'd call the refrigerator people or the washing machine people and say, you know, my fridge doesn't work. Can you send a guy to fix it?
Right.
And now they're saying sometimes they're not even selling it. It remains in the ownership of the fridge manufacturer or the washing machine, and I'm paying a subscription, so I'm paying for a right to use. So my son's living in the Netherlands, he's paying for a right to use his washing machine at the moment, rather than, you know, I have a washing machine, old-fashioned girl that I am, in my cellar. But you
it's
can
a
see
millennial thing.
You see the way the businesses are working, because of course it's a huge capital investment for him to buy a washing machine while still being a student in the Netherlands. So he's paying for a right to use his washing machine. It makes sense for him at the moment. And of course, you're then looking at the charging model and so on. And there's two parts then to the question. The one is the physical costs of making the refrigerator and so on, and getting it to him, or getting the washing machine to him. And the other part is the billing and what's the perfect price, and how do you get that back over time. And you've got this you've almost got to change. You've got more like the situation that you would have had with the telephone companies beforehand, where they were building infrastructure. So they would have these huge capital expense projects, and then you and I would telephone and use that infrastructure, and it was about getting this sweet pricing point for how much should a call cost. It's now how much should a wash cost, or how are you going to do pay per use on a refrigerator. It's a very different approach to business, and there's a lot of dynamism in there. And you know, we were trying to talk about some of that in the book, while being totally aware that, you know, this is a developing, it's not even a market, it's a developing world. The world is driving it. The market is rushing to try and keep up.
Yeah, like I was talking to a cell phone company, and they were like, yeah, when we first installed SAP, we were just, you know, it was cell phones, but now we're selling, you know, the towers, the services on the towers that we have, and we have to, like, you know, maintain those towers, and we're selling that product. And now we're doing, you know, we're, instead of a cell phone, now we're, you know, renting them, or we're putting them on like payment plans. So now they're the bank, you know, and then they have retail stores, and they have online stores, and so all of a sudden costing has become very confusing, I think.
That's right. And of course, it's really hard to say what's right. And you're trying to make decisions in a very dynamic market. It's quite a big difference from saying I've got 3 years development time to make the optimum car and, you know, squeeze a few more cents out of the engine. It's a much more dynamic environment that everybody's working in. And of course, they're coming to us and saying, so SAP, what are you going to do? How are you going to help me?
What do you say? Well,
we try to talk it through and try to, I mean, for us, it's a challenge as well, because we're also in a dynamic market. We as a company are going from being an on-premise, huge upfront capital investment in your software to being a cloud supplier. And obviously, you know, the dynamics of our market are changing dramatically. And so even our own people are kind of trying to understand what their cost structures are, and what it means to have more servers, and what it means to do the operations, and what it means for us to be doing some of the things that typically used to happen at the customer site. So a lot of the work of actually managing the systems and applying the updates and so on is actually at SAP site now, if you're running a cloud system. And again, that changes your costing structure. And
yeah, I mean, even people working from home changes. I mean, and what about, like, we were talking about, you know, things that happen that are so, and I know we don't really want to talk about this, but this is really interesting because of what's happening with the supply chain, with the countries that we now are like blocked, or things are rerouting and stuff, and it's taking longer. And, you know, I'm sure people are coming to you saying, what do I do?
Very much so. So, I mean, obviously they don't typically come with a specific, you know, how do I handle this particular, it's more about, how do I understand the impact of what's happening? So we have a lot of conversations around, you know, where are my key suppliers? How can I identify the fact that I've only got one supplier in a certain country? And what happens if that country is suddenly in a problem zone? And I think that's another big change, and something we were trying to address in the book, between the world of 30 years ago, where you were talking very much about making the washing machine in one plant. Right. And now you're talking about a global supply chain, where you've got gearboxes being made in Romania, you've got the car being put together in Germany, you've got it being shipped out to Spain, and you're trying to follow those chains and understand where the potential risks are in that chain, what's the environmental footprint. There's all sorts of things that, you know, it used to be just a question of rolling up the costs, trying to get them into a common language, so a common currencies, common accounting structures.
Yeah.
Now it's about saying we've got this chain, we can understand this chain, but let's understand the impact of that chain. So, all we do with business with Russia at the moment, what happens if we can't do business with Russia anymore? Where's my supply chain going to fall down? Because, and it's often about really trying to understand not just what you're doing yourself, but also your subcontractors and so on. Costing has really reached out into all these questions, because it's not just a pure cost question, but it's often the costing that gives you the understanding, is this super critical? Do I really need to be fixing this problem, or can I maybe manage?
Even the currency changing and currency values going on right now. I mean, up and down, and
That's right. And that's obviously also something that's got a whole lot more volatile and has been pushing requirements to us. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we typically find is we actually run out of currencies in controlling, and that's something that's just changing at the moment. So if you imagine a US headquartered customer, then their corporate currency is obviously going to be US dollars.
Right.
They're probably operating in Europe, so they've got a euro in a lot of their countries. That's fine, that's two. But then they're also operating in Switzerland. Well, their local currency is Swiss francs, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
US dollar and Swiss francs, no problem. But because their Swiss company is operating to a large extent with euro, they actually have a legal requirement to keep euros as well.
Mm.
And that's where things start to get challenging. And so that's where we've been saying we actually have to change this. So the Universal Journal can handle 10 currencies, and we're going to the stage with on-premise 2021, where you can have those currencies neatly in each column and handled completely separately, which means then you can really see what's happening for this. You're not constantly converting, but you're looking at the Swiss franc column or the US dollar column or the euro column and treating that separately. And because the swings between them are quite significant, it can be really interesting to look what the different flows are doing in those currencies.
What do you think is going to be the biggest change forward? Like, what do you think customers are going to say, like, you guys really did this. This would really impact my business for the better. Is there anything that,
I mean, the big scary one for us at the moment in terms of it being fascinating but huge is probably the whole sustainability thing. Mm-hmm. So trying to look at things like carbon footprint across the supply chain. So to go from this, what's a basic costing idea that you're going from widget to semi-finished product to finished product to something that you can sell to the customer. Mm-hmm. And the idea that you can follow that chain and say, okay, what's the energy impact? How much green energy is in there? How much carbon is in the component? And then to roll that all the way through. So you can actually have a carbon balance sheet and see what you're using. And, there's a lot of research going on at the moment, a lot of clever people getting together and say what they would like to do. And then there's the technology challenge of how would you actually do it? It's basically a costing question, but you can try and do it in a huge Excel sheet, or you can try and do it in an integrated system. And as SAP, we're saying, we're the guys with the integrated system. We've got all the information somewhere, in a lot of cases, but how do we roll it all together? Yeah. And you're seeing the regulatory requirements around those things really changing. So it used to be just about carbon trading and having a vague idea how much carbon there was you were involved with, and buying and selling that like a financial instrument. And now it's becoming super critical to your whole supply chain. So people are envisaging a time down the line where just like you pick up a jar of jam and read the ingredients, you'd also read the carbon impact on it. And
really, that's totally new with me. That's neat. Things like that, no one would have, we don't think about that until after, but one person starts it and then the next person. But do you think that controlling has got easier or more difficult?
That's a tricky one. I mean, I certainly remember my very first days in Waldorf at the training center. And I went home after day 3 of the costing course, of the controlling course, and I cried. And I said to my husband, I'm in completely the wrong place. I don't understand anything. I've made a big, big mistake. And he was like, pull yourself together. And the interesting thing, of course, and I could see these sort of black screens with the green writing going on in front of me. And I was just like, I'm never going to understand that. And what's really wonderful is we've actually built some Furies now that make that sort of experience something of the past. We can visualize those flows now. The Furies, some of the allocation flows or the material value chain flows, I think are fantastic. They're just worlds away from what I grew up with. So hopefully, Janet in Waldorf wouldn't cry because she thought she wasn't going to ever understand this stuff. However, the business challenges are actually got a whole lot bigger. What I was learning to do then was basically to take heating costs and assign them to the factory floor, and it was all relatively straightforward. But now I'll be talking to the big guys who are doing their research in one part of Germany, and they want to charge all those costs out to the rest of the world. And there's all kind of service charging challenges that go with that. It's a lot more complicated than just trying to take all your costs and assign them to your products and your market segments, as people were trying to do 30 years ago.
So do you think because so with SAP changing so much, and now that you're able to do a little bit more like all these moving parts, and you're able to, like you said, with the Fiori interfaces, do you think it's easier to describe information now to people? Or
that was the challenge of the book, and I'd actually be interested in some comments from readers, because I did actually try wherever I could to explain using the new user interfaces. So I really used the T account apps and said, look, this is balance sheet, this is P&L, and this is how it flows through. And I tried to tell the story through our screens.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I was doing this with 30 years experience in my head. What I really need is somebody who, left college last week to sit there and go through my book and go, Janet, no. Or maybe
I thought that's what your husband's for.
Exactly. My husband's the engineer, and my husband regularly reads things and says, Janet, no, that is not logical. It's always good to have an engineer to run this by. It can be a little bit Mr. Spock, a little bit too logical, but it's good, because I'm a linguist, he accuses me of being woolly-minded and not clear. And so together we get to something that I hope is readable and helpful.
Oh, that's pretty good. So what, let's see. So what's your favorite part of controlling?
I'm still a product costing person at heart. I still love that moment where you walk into somebody's factory and you can see the products, that they're proudly showing we make whatever it is, and then being able to follow the raw materials around the factory and just understand the flows. I find that so much easier to visualize than allocations, even after all this time. I mean, I had a wonderful term from one of our customers who said, oh yeah, all that financial voodoo, what's really important is here on the shop floor. And I still feel a bit like that.
I like it too, because I like some of the quality guys don't realize, the product costing and everything, the purchasing and all this, that if something's not good and doesn't work, stop, don't use them anymore. And then it changes the costing of what it came to, or, and everything kind of is fluid. It's not always consistent, because it depends on when you bought something, maybe it's a better vendor or a different supply chain, so products can fluctuate and go up and down.
That's right. And that's totally natural. But I think the whole point of a lot of cost accountants is they want to really pin it down and have the answer. And in fact,
average.
Exactly. And the truth is raw materials are fluctuating like crazy. I mean, anything you're buying as a commodity, there isn't one price for it. It's the spot price on the day. And a lot of production processes are fluctuating like crazy. I mean, you've got your washing machine where it's pretty clear what's going into a washing machine, but you've also got your chemical processes where, it's like making bread. You need a different amount of water every time, just depending on the temperature of your kitchen and the humidity of the day and all that sort of thing. And you've got the whole gamut, which I find fascinating.
So what do you think that the biggest challenges are at the moment, like within ledgers and, currencies? I mean, we've talked about that. Anything else that you can think of that the customers are trying to?
I mean, I think the reason most people want to come and talk to me is they want to be future-proof. They want to know what we're planning to do 2 years down the line so that they don't make a mistake today. And then they want to know exactly which day of the week I'm going to release it. But that's kind of that's life. But, a lot of people are moving from the old world with the separate accounting and controlling, and they're trying to put the two together. And they're trying to bring this idea of a ledger into controlling, and they're trying to understand how many ledgers they need and what the different purposes of the ledger is. So they're, to go back to my US headquartered company, I've probably got a US, I probably want US GAAP for everybody, so I can actually have a corporate view of the world. And then in each of the subsidiaries I'm working in, I obviously have US GAAP locally for my US companies, but I've got Canadian GAAP, Mexican GAAP, you name it, in that second ledger. And some of them are starting to understand the future and saying, well, because we're all friends and family, we're all part of a consolidated group, we'd like to start eliminating and storing those elimination postings by ledger. And that's something we're working on at the moment. We're planning to bring it out. So it's not in the book yet. I can only write about stuff we've written.
I hear that.
Book. But, you know, the future is bright, but the future is pretty complicated compared to the world we all grew up in, where what you would have historically was often, you know, single plants with single ERP instances, and then a great big data warehouse sort of hooked over the top and trying to pull the pieces together and make sense of it. And we're saying as SAP, hey, you can have a common data model now. But then, of course, you've got three people at the table with very different requirements, all trying to squeeze into one box. And what should we do, Mrs. Salmon?
I don't know. Oh, me. So we were talking about, so change management. How did you handle like change management, even in your own book? Because big changes in controlling. So, you know, what are some of the, you know, can you describe that, you know, in a different way? I mean,
what we tried to do was we tried to say, let's assume we're doing things the modern way. Let's assume we've got a universal journal there. Let's assume we're using margin analysis rather than costing-based profitability analysis. Let's at least mention that there's this event-based production accounting coming. Partly, of course, to be future-proof, so we can hopefully write an edition 2 or 3 years down the line, you know, self-preservation being part of this.
You might be right. Once a year.
We wanted to be future-proof, and we wanted to give people the idea this is where you want to go to. But we also knew that probably 60-70% of the people reading our book initially wouldn't even have an S4 in front of them. They're trying to make the decision, do they have to go? Would they want it? Or even if they've got an S4 in front of them, it's not the most modern one. They may be on 1610, which for me is 4 years ago. And, you know, so even if we showed a Fiori, we tried to say, don't worry if you haven't got the Fiori, this is the transaction code, which allows you to do something similar. So we were often doing this hop, where we'd be putting boxes and saying, look, this is how it used to be in ERP. This is what you might know, but look, it's different now. Or, you know, don't worry too much if you haven't got the fancy Fiori, because look, you can still do it. It's like this. And every so often we really had to say, you know, the T account is only in Fiori.
Right.
But we try to not leave people along the way, because I know it drives me crazy if people describe something that I can't do today.
Yeah, I completely understand that. I like the way that you wrote the book. I mean, you know, you think about who you're writing the book for, because a lot of people write it just either it's just so over everybody's head and everybody's like, well, what are they talking about? Or you're the wrong audience. But if, you know, I like the fact that you're writing this for the people that are using the system, using the, you know, every day, you know, somebody in finance could pick this up and be like, this makes a lot more sense what I'm doing, you know. And
that was really our aim. We knew there's a lot of high level sort of fluffy marketing stuff, which we were like, no. And there's a lot of nitty gritty error analysis. If you can search pretty much any error message on the net and you'll have some answer, but the sort of big picture, what are you trying to do? That was what we were trying to capture. And the idea, when I wrote my first book, I actually worked with one of my accounting friends, and I would run it by him occasionally and say, Harry, does this make sense to you? Because I wanted to be able to pick up somebody with an accounting qualification and sort of gently hold him by the hand and say, it's technology, but don't worry. But I've also found that a lot of the IT people read my books because they want to have enough understanding of the business to be able to talk to business people. So it's kind of this bridging, which actually takes you back to that. You asked me right at the beginning, you're a linguist, aren't you? And originally my career plan was that I was going to be an interpreter, and I was going to do French and German simultaneous translating. I didn't get a job, and I think actually I ended up in a better place that suits me better. But that idea of trying to bring two people together who are talking different languages and don't understand each other is where my book meets. There's the IT people going, oh, I don't really understand this business. Well, what's a T account then? And then of course the finance people going, oh, there's all this HANA stuff. I'm not really very happy about that. And trying to get the two to meet and be able to talk, at least have a conversation with each other.
Right. Oh, I totally agree with that. I deal with that all the time. I always try to dummy it down. I think that sometimes it's easier. Then you can bring it up a level, but just get everybody on the same page, and then they can start understanding. But anybody out there that's, has somebody in your finance department that's confused or needs to kind of get the big picture of what this is all about, great book to pick up and let them, read it and get an understanding of what this is all about, because it is a big game changer. If you're an ECC guy, if you've been on that for 10 years and, you hanging out, and now you're going to be jumping to something totally different, they're like, what, everything's
exactly. And I have those conversations regularly. So, I was talking to somebody this morning who claimed to have started in R2, which was at least 30 years ago, and was now looking at our cloud product. And of course, he didn't recognize very much. And it's very frustrating because, here he was, 30 years experience. Hey, I'm cool. I do SAP. And oh, which Furies do I need? Where's the information? Where do I find my contribution margins? He was all over the place.
All over the place.
And, you have to help those people. And we as SAP have to help those people. Otherwise, they go somewhere else. They think, that nice world that they thought they understood has gone away.
Yeah. That's why we're here. We're always here too, to help people understand. I think that's the best thing to do, is if you help them understand, then they'll be fine. Okay, so this is their next part. We're going to open it up and let people ask questions. So what we want you to do is to, let's see, I'm going to have a little chat thingy here. And okay, SAP Press is telling us to send a message and ask questions on the chat. And then, we already got one. So instead of using COSP, cost tables, should we use COSP_BAK or ACDOCA table in S/4HANA?
Okay, no, very good question. And actually, it's one of those things where the marketing speak tends to overtake the real world speak. So for those of you who didn't quite get the question, so COSP is the old primary cost table, and it's the old totals table. And it was very much there in my first book, but it's been eliminated in my second book. And what we did in return, you'll have seen in the conversion programs, we wrote a backup table. So COSP BCK is the backup table for everything we found in your system when we did the conversion. And we stored the data there just so that we could then go object for object and say, this is the sum of the total, this is the sum of your line items, and this is what we have in the totals. And so long as the two match, in principle, you didn't need your totals table anymore. But if they didn't match, it was a sign for us that you'd archived some of your line items and that we needed to create an extra document that just documented what we could find. So neither COSP or COSP BCK are actually real tables anymore. They're just views. But it's not quite as simple as that. All the actual costs are in the Universal Journal. So your actual cost, your actual revenue, anything that's going as a primary or a secondary cost or a revenue is in the Universal Journal, and you're accessing it just by views. But table COSP isn't totally empty. There's still a few things that we update in there. So we still update statistical costs. We still update some of the public sector business processes. But you shouldn't really be using those views actively anymore. You should be accessing the data from Universal Journal directly. So all our new Furies read from the Universal Journal from Act OK directly. And we've been reworking the settlement programs, the allocation programs, basically anything that goes into the totals tables and says, give me the cost for March. And instead of getting them out of the totals tables or getting them via the view, we've been getting them directly from the Universal Journals, which has allowed us to do some of the things like universal allocation. So, COSP looks like it's still there. If you do SE11, you'll still see it, but it's actually just a view. It's what we call a compatibility view to make sure that anything that anybody might have written that used to be using those tables carries on working.
So are there any industries that are like just, because I'm sure everything is still, industry specific, but is there any industry that we're costing is just feel bad for that industry. I always wonder, what's the worst costing industry?
What's the worst industry to be in? I'm not sure.
Clear that one.
They always have they all have their different challenges, I think. And I think one of the things that we're seeing changing is I used to be very clear about, use the coding block if you want to extend where you want to have balance sheet and profit and loss in. And COPA, the operating concern, is profit and loss. And we're now starting to see those borders merge now, that you're getting things like work in process and so on showing up with the market segments attached. So my old definition of COPA as being basically just a more detailed version of your profit and loss is actually starting to change. And we're reworking that so that you can have balance sheet items. And that's a long process because it depends very much on the industry. So we're quite a long way with commercial projects. We're right at the beginning if you're a bank or a media company, you know, a couple of years.
I wonder with what industries out there that you really haven't touched in costing, you know?
And you've usually been there in some shape or form. The one group of customers that I've never had anything to do with has been railways for some reason. I know we have railway customers, but they've never spoken to me. So if there's any railway people out there, feel free to drop me a line and tell me how you do costing.
I know. She wants to know about those parts, putting parts on there. Let's see. Does your book content some of the configuration as well? Do you have some configuration content in the book?
It's not a really configuration heavy book. So if you really want configuration, I think there is another SAP Press book about configuration. So we mention configuration where we need it to make sense of what we're describing. But we're working more from the kind of business process and what's behind it. So we do talk about things like field status variance and you know, the configuration that goes on behind an account. We talk about how to set up extensibility in the operating concern and so on, but it's not going to walk you through every single setting in the costing variant or in the order type. If that's really what you're after, there are other books. We only use it where we felt we needed it to explain what we were talking about in general.
Okay, here's a good one. What would be your sample procedure for switching from costing-based profitability analysis in R3 to the new accounting-based COPA in S/4HANA? And how would you organize a possible transition period or startup period in the new S4 system with account-based COPA?
That's a good question. So if you're doing a migration project, we recommend you, if you've been doing profitability analysis before, to activate account-based profitability analysis as you get into the new system. And what that'll do is it'll create columns in the Universal Journal for all the characteristics that you had in your old operating concern. Now, what most people do is they don't actually turn off costing-based COPA on day one after their migration. They typically keep it running for a couple of years. Partly this is just so that they've got old historical data. So what will happen after the migration, the first document, the first revenue, the first cost of goods sold that you post will have all the market segments attached in the Universal Journal. But all the documents from the 10 years that you brought with you during your conversion, they won't have that information. They'll only know which profit center they belong to, which company code, maybe which functional area, but they won't have that nitty-gritty detail of the product, the region, and so on. So we usually recommend people to just keep filling the tables. For most people do it for 2 years. And then they say, okay, I'm going to turn off costing-based COPA. Unless there's some really pressing reason where there's something they really want to do in costing-based COPA that we don't actually support in margin analysis.
Interesting. So any recommendations when using the closing cockpit?
You've caught me off balance there. I used to be the product manager for Closing Cockpit about 10 years ago. And now I've got this sort of hazy half knowledge of what it does now. I mean, obviously there's various iterations of the Closing Cockpit out there. From the old Clocko transaction and the old Schedule Manager transaction right up to the advanced financial close today. But I think from a business point of view, the key thing is to really be very, very clear about, it's all about orchestrating your close. So it's about understanding the dependencies. And I mean, some of it's obvious, you know, you don't want to be running your allocations until you've done your depreciation and you've got your payroll in. Otherwise, you're going to have to do it again because you didn't have all the data. But it's hard for us as SAP to really deliver you the cookbook that says, you know, first run your allocation, then do this, then do the other. Because you'll have these sort of relationships where you've got internal orders that have got to settle the cost centers first. You really need to go item by item through the list. And I did try to do that in my old book. And this time we we didn't really focus so much on the period close. I think we were kind of taking our own medicine and saying we're trying to go to this event-based thing, and the period close shouldn't be this huge heavy lifting effort anymore. But obviously, there are still allocations that happen at period close. There are some things that you really do have to wait for the period close. But we didn't have it as a huge dedicated chapter this time, which I did in my original book. So if you want a cookbook, the old book had one of those, at least for CO transactions.
So go back one book on that one. Let's see. What's another good one we have? Anybody? Come on, guys. Give me some good ones. I have some. All right. Well, let's I think that we should ask Janet some of my questions while we're hanging out here.
Especially good ones.
I know some of my good ones. One of my biggest questions is that, what do you think of Fiori apps? Do you think it's going to, I don't know why I'm all into this, but so do you think it's going to help a company like the user be able to do their job better because limited training, or do you think it's going to hurt a company because the person's not going to actually understand the entire process of what they or how they impact the process?
I mean, it's a good question. When we first started Fiori development, I used to tell my developers that they were developing for my children who had no patience, never read a manual, and either worked immediately or the device was thrown away.
Yeah.
And I still think there's an element of that in Fiori now. You're aiming for a different generation. And of course, as SAP now, not everybody's been here 30 years. We've got the new hires as well who actually want to do Fiori as much as possible. They also want to work developing Fiori. They don't want to do the old stuff. I think you've also got to remember, way back when I started, you used to spend a week in Waldorf just learning how to do FB01 and all the different permutations that you could post there. I mean, you could do everything. It was the original Swiss penknife, but you had to know what you were doing.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we're trying to help people more, but there can be at times where the Fiori is frustrating because you can do it the old way, and you almost have to accept that things are different, and I get a lot of requests from people saying, can you give me a one-to-one transaction list of how many of these are in Fiori? And when I tell my Fiori developers to get going, I don't typically say, can you do KB21 now? I try and work around the business question and try to get them to work around the business question and understand. So you'll see all sorts of nice things coming out of those conversations. So like our allocation cycles have Excel uploads, so you can upload the senders and receivers into them, things that we never had before.
Yeah, because I understand the whole concept, and I understand like different generation, but I also think there's a point of just understanding, when we're talking about costing, how much is, you spending here, there, and yonder to make this number. A lot of people just don't get the whole concept,
That's right. And that's a challenge in Fiori. How do you try and explain something like an actual costing run when it's got millions and millions of records in and all sorts of influence factors? And obviously people say, use artificial intelligence, it'll do a big red circle around the problem.
I know. So here's one. Any insight you can provide on the universal parallel accounting? What is the expected effort to change from current model to UPA?
It's a good question. So anybody who wants to know what universal parallel accounting actually is, if you search the blogs, it came out in the cloud edition of 2105. So you'll find the explanations of what's different in asset accounting, controlling, production accounting, and actual costing out there. Of course, the challenge is then, how do you convert? How do you go from the way you do it today to the way you maybe want to do it in the future? When we go out in the autumn, our plan is to only go for greenfield customers. So we're saying, put the structure in and then feed your data in, but we haven't actually got conversion tools. And of course, I'm now talking to all the customers who've got all sorts of different ways of doing it. So, the first challenge is actually to understand how you're doing this thing today, because you probably have some form of parallel accounting already, whether it's you've implemented the old parallel cost of goods manufactured, or you've been using ledgers and multiple ledgers in the general ledger, but maybe you haven't had your controlling attached to anything other than the leading ledger. So I think sometimes it's a philosophical question. Have you been the sort of customer that's been very, very centralized and tried to push out a template to all your local subsidiaries, and then allowed them to do some kind of adjustment postings for whatever they specifically need in India or Russia or whatever? Yeah. And others that have been very much island implementations where every island has gone ahead and built its own stuff. And so you really need a laundry list of what you're doing today and what's different. And then you start to understand how you can move forward. So maybe you've had lots of different valuations in asset accounting, but you've basically had one in controlling and one in actual costing. And then the question is, how different are they, and where do you want to be? How do you want to? Is it even material to represent them? I mean, I can remember having discussions with people where you could derive, I think it was Japanese GAAP from US GAAP with actually only a few postings. Or is it really important to keep them separate and really understand them? And from a conversion point of view, that's our challenge for the next really? While, to try and take everybody with us. And
so are they fighting you, or are they like, yeah?
Almost everybody's coming and saying, when are you going to be finished with the conversion tools? Or will, and when will be there, and you know, how do we? And it's a totally reasonable question, because of course there's the R3 people haven't made the leap at all.
Yeah.
And what I often found is they're still using the design that they put in place in 1993, and they haven't really made significant changes to it at all. And others are going for a transformation and saying, okay, we're going to take this ledger approach, we're going to think through our currencies and what have you. And they're putting in structures today, knowing that we're doing something down the line, and they want to be able to make a small leap then down the line to where it's going to be.
Yeah, once they get so over config, boy. Whew. One thing, talk about configuration. So one of the questions that came up, which is probably a lot of people are asking this one, how do you see the role of an SAP consultant in the future? So for instance, do you expect less configuration around the HANA versions? Do you expect less configurable HANA versions?
I mean, what we're trying to do is we're trying to not force you to, so asset accounting is a really good example. Asset accounting used to have about 15, 20 tables where you did all these different things. And we're now saying, no, it's all related to the ledger and it's all in one place. And the idea is to ask you business questions rather than all sorts of super techie questions.
Yeah.
So, because that's often been the challenge in the past. You get somebody who's come from the business, knew asset accounting as an application really well, but couldn't really relate it to the config in the system. And so we are trying to simplify that. But of course, the challenge is not to take away those sort of configurations options where it really was a philosophical question. You could do it that way, you could do it that way, and both approaches had their pros and cons. Yeah. And obviously, if you go to the pure cloud approach, then there's almost no configuration. We deliver the settings for your order types and your costing variants and you name it. And of course, what do I get every day? Oh, please, can you open up the costing variant again? I need to be able to change the settings. And of course, what we're trying to hide is we want to only allow those things that are supported in the cloud. So it's a completely different way of, rather than having this Swiss Army penknife of you can do just about anything. You're going to
they'll change that?
I think we are going to have to open up some things a lot more than we did. And I mean, that takes you back to the role of the CO consultant. You know, for a while, probably 20 years ago, if you knew the costing variants and the cost elements and the cost component structures, you could probably travel from customer to customer.
Yeah, product costing, yeah.
You know, if you were the whiz at that was you sorted. And now here's me saying, no, it's all hidden. We're not going to let you touch that. I think the challenge, though, is going to be being the business person that actually talks to people and says, look, you know, the conversation I was trying to have today, so this is margin analysis, this is how it works, this is how you get to your contribution margins. These are our standard reports, but would you like, you know, do you need something more specific to your organization? You know, these are the characteristics. Do you need something more specific to you? There's still going to be that configuration effort, but not configuration at all costs, you know, that we pretty much gave you a table and said, you know, do what you like with your order types.
Yeah. So
and of
not
course,
completely.
that's your challenge at the moment. We tried to put things like the scope items in the book just so you had a reference point to go and say, okay, J54, that's overhead accounting.
Here's one. We have a lot of, wait a minute, let me get this. All right, here we go. We have a lot of documents in the database tables on our SAP material ledger because of batch single validation. When switching to S/4HANA, our cost for storage space would therefore be enormous. So archiving in R3 deletes access to the archived ML documents via CKM3N, material price analysis. Is there an archiving option in the new S4 that still allows access to the original ML documents via the CKM3N?
I mean, you've definitely got to switch in the material ledger because the actual costing tables switch in 1610. So we go to a flatter structure. So you've got the ML doc and the ML doc CCS. And obviously we try and convert everything we found in the system. So anything that you've already archived, we wouldn't touch. We would just convert the new stuff or the stuff that's still there.
I think they want to know, can you still have access to it?
Can you still have access to the stuff?
Is there an archiving option in the new S4 that will allow you to have access to the original ML documents?
I need to check on that one. I know we've got archiving access to the normal journal entries and so on, but I'm not quite sure on the new material ledger documents. But
okay, we'll table that one for that. Here's another one. When a new business client start to use COPA for the first time, what will be the most important thing that they need to understand about the transaction side and potential of a COPA setup if they currently are only understanding the management controlling module via front reporting? I think I read that wrong, but let me try that again. When a new business client starts to use the COPA for the first time, what will be the most important thing they need to understand about the transaction side and the potential of a COPA setup if they currently are only understanding the management controlling module?
I mean, in fact, it should be easier to understand margin analysis than it was to understand costing-based COPA, because essentially your margin analysis becomes just this multi-dimensional cost object. So, if you've been used to posting costs against cost centers, orders, projects, you're just posting revenues against this multi-dimensional thing. And of course, which dimensions you choose, that's as important as it ever was, because you want to decide how you structure and segment your business and what you want to look at. But your revenues and cost of goods sold will be automatically assigned at that level. And I think then the challenge is, as you do your allocations, to allocate at a level that makes sense, because you can very quickly, with something like top-down distribution, generate millions and millions of data records with about 2 cents in them. And it'll then take forever to post, and the business rationale behind it is almost zero. So my favorite example was a paint factory in India who were trying to look at each individual color of paint in each shop in India. And you can imagine the number of potential combinations were just enormous. And you take $1,000 or 1,000 rupees and spread it across all of those combinations, and you end up with vast numbers of documents that don't actually tell you very much at all. And so the point is to kind of take the step back and say, what decisions are you going to drive off that? And that's almost irrespective of whether you're on ERP or whether you're on S/4HANA. What decisions are you going to drive off it, and how granular can you be usefully?
Yeah. What about this one? How many custom fields can a company add to the Universal Journal, ACDOCA? And if you add custom fields, will that cause problems during an upgrade?
No, it shouldn't. I mean, you can have up to 60 characteristics in the Universal Journal as part of the market segment. So you've got to imagine that the Universal Journal has got its, 350 fields or so. And there's various extension points. So you can add coding block extensions, and there are different constraints on adding coding blocks to adding characteristics in COPA. At the moment, we've still got the limit of 60. And, that's my second most frequent question. When are you going to change that? Because you said Hannah could do everything.
Yeah.
And, at some point, we'll try and get away from that. But at the moment, we've got a lot of interfaces that still stop at 60 characteristics.
Mm.
But I think the challenge is more what you're going to assign to them and when you're going to end up with too many tiny documents.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What is the future of investment management in S4? I cannot find standard Fioris to support investment from IM program to investment measure follow-up.
Yep, good question. So I think there's an SAP note written by me that says investment management is still there and it does what it does. It's the short version of it. Basically, we haven't yet got round to creating Fioris there. There was a lot of debate internally about, what's the role of investment management versus EPPM, and, because investment management was always single system and EPPM was always cross system and was generating WBS elements and so on as their operative structure. I think there is still a future for IM. Certainly, even in the cloud, you'll find a small amount of IM. So you'll find that you can still create projects that generate assets under construction, and all the kind of accounting entries that go with investment management are in the cloud. But what's missing is this kind of umbrella structure that sits over the top in the form of the investment program and the investment program items and all those budgeting and planning functions.
Yeah.
So we talk about it briefly in the book, but they're not in Fiori. They're a bit of a style break in the book, but I try to be honest.
That's okay. To be seen. But I just want to tell everybody again that, so the book discount on the book is Book Club 15% off on her book. And I hope everyone has loved talking to Janet and getting the inside scoop on what's happening with the whole world of costing. It's really changing really fast. Industries, everything is going crazy. And again, I'm Kendall Tyler with DXC. So, and if you're going to Sapphire, come visit me, come find me and say hey, and let me know that you watch and that you're a fan. So all fans show up. And I hope Janet gets to come. But I don't know if they'll let you out of Germany right now. But
at the moment, I can't get out of Germany. Otherwise, I would be there. I'd be in the fan club. I
know. See,
hopefully one day.
We could have had a cup of tea together.
Exactly.
We'll do that one day.
I would have brought you a teacup.
There you go. But thank you, everybody. And thanks for joining us. And we'll do this again. And we'll have to say cheers.
Yes, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.